I didn't want people to serve me, though. I didn't want to meet my needs. I didn't want to open up to people and trust people because I was afraid. I was afraid of the judgment. I was afraid of being rejected. I thought that it was just easier to control. It was my life and manage it by myself. I didn't want to let others in. And so I lived this way for a long time. But after a while, I decided I would give community a chance. And so soon I found myself in a vulnerable relationship, a vulnerable community where we were seemingly authentically living with one another. We were seemingly authentically there for one another. We were walking through all of life with one another. We were talking about Christ. We were talking about our faith. We were wrestling with our faith. We met each other where we were at. And we served each other. And despite the red flags, despite the unhealthiness of the community, we would claim that Christ was in the center of it. But he wasn't. Christ was the topic of conversation. But he wasn't. We were leaning on each other. I wouldn't admit it at that time, but I was turning to my community at that time to save me. Christ is the only one that can save us. He needs to be in the center of our life. We need to lean on Christ together in community. And the problem with this unhealthy relationship, this unhealthy community that I found myself in, was that I was turning to the community, I was turning to the relationship to save me, to meet my needs. You can have a Bible study that is seemingly Christ-centered, but if you're turning to it to support you, that's not a Christ-centered Bible study. Christ is not the topic of conversation. He needs to be the focus. He needs to be who you're leaning on. Do you see the difference? Do you see what I'm getting at? What I didn't get is I was living in two extremes. I was first living in the extreme of that I was just going to lean on Christ, but not in this community, which was a contradiction. And then I was like, okay, fine, I'll live in community. But I was just talking about Christ as I leaned on community. And that's not what we're called to. A Christ-centered community is leaning on Christ in community with one another, being accountable, being there for one another, and directing each other toward Christ. After this unhealthy community, I decided even more so that this was not for me. I thought the idea of sticking a bunch of sinners in a room and having them figure out their problems might be similar to watching a bad soap opera. Thank you, but no thank you. And so instead of allowing people to shine light into my life, I let the problems that I was carrying fester within. I carried all my burdens, and I didn't let people shine light into my life. And so freshman year, I had to come up with other ways to relieve the pain that I was feeling. I started taking sharp objects to the inner part of my arm. I soon fell into depression, and I struggled with this for a long time. It wasn't long before this thought of escaping the daily struggle of my life through death consumed me. And I was fighting this battle every day, but I was fighting it alone because I didn't want people to know. I didn't want people to be there for me. I would walk in the hallways, and when the burden within me would get to the point where I thought that I might blow my cover, and goodness knows that people might see that I wasn't doing okay, I would run to the prayer room where I would sit and I would cry. I would cry to God, but I would never cry with another brother or sister because I didn't want to be rejected. The next second after I was done in the prayer room, I would whip my mask back on, and you would see me laughing in the hallway. I lived in the hallway. Bethel, a lot of the struggles I'm talking about are not from like way back when. Some of them are from just last semester. I've not arrived at any point. I don't know how to live in an authentic community with each other. I'm not up here because I have done it successfully. I'm up here because Christ has shown me that that is what we're called to live in. That we can't live for Christ without living together, without being vulnerable and open with one another, without telling people what's going on in our life. Part of the reason why I was so adamant about this community not working is because I thought that community had to be perfect. First, I have another point before I get to that point. I soon realized that if you stick a bunch of sinners in a room that are striving after Christ and trying to figure out their problems, you don't get a bad soap opera. You get a beautiful picture of what Christ is. You find that authentic love. You see a vulnerability that can only be found if Christ is in the center. The reason why I was so adamant about community networking is because I thought it had to be perfect. I would come and I would listen to talks on community, and I would say, oh, that's a great idea, but completely unrealistic. I thought that people, the community that people were talking about was a community of people that were always there for each other, that always knew what to say, that always had fun together. We've all had new groups of friends, new roommates, new coworkers, new social groups, and sometimes they turn out really good. They start off and you're like, BFF, you're my soulmate. You're like, this person is perfect and we're going to live in this community together. And then all of a sudden, they start wearing that blue shirt. And you're like, oh my gosh, I hate the blue shirt. And so what do? You turn to your new community. You've turned to your new found group, social group. And you're like, oh my gosh, can you believe they wore the blue shirt? But then they start wearing the blue shirt. And you're like, oh my gosh, is that a blue shirt? And so then you go to the next group. And you're constantly trying to find this perfect group. This group that won't wear the blue shirt. But everyone wears the blue shirt. How ironic.